button on my side if you want me to push it.
No, we should be all set now.
Perfect. Okay, we'll get started then. So hi everyone, and welcome to today's invited talk, which is part of the Leeds seminar series. I'm Luca Carlone, and I'm an associate professor in Aeroastronaut and PI in Leeds. And today is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Professor Jitendra Malik. Professor Malik is the Arthur J. Chik Professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of California at Berkeley. He's also on the faculty of the Department of Bioengineering and the Cognitive Science and Vision Science groups. He previously served as the chair of the Computer Science Division and as the department chair of ECS. And more recently, he also served as research director and site lead of Facebook AI research in Menlo Park. So most of you will know Professor Malik's research. His group has been working on many different topics in computer vision, human vision, computer graphics, and the analysis of biological images. And his work really contributed to pioneering several foundational concepts in vision, such as anisotropic diffusion, normalized cuts, high dynamic range imaging, shape context, and RCNN. So Professor Malik has received numerous awards for his work. I will not take too much time listing all of them, but I will just list a few awards here. He won 2 Longitt-Higgins Prize at CVPR, 3 Helmut Prize at ICCV. He received the 2013 IEEE PAMI TC Distinguished Researcher in Computer Vision Award, the ACM AAAI Allen Newell Award, the IJKI Award for Research Excellence in AI, and also the IEEE Computer Science Computer Pioneer Award. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Sciences, and a fellow of the American Academy of Art and Sciences. So Jitendra, thanks for being here, and the stage is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Luca, and for this very kind introduction. And thank you to all my colleagues at MIT for being at this lecture. I really do wish it was in person, but we must do what we can. So this is a robotics talk. So we should start by seeing a robot. And this is our robot. It's a quadruped. It's a so-called A1 robot manufactured by a company called AlienGo. It's a very cheap robot. I mean, I think you can get these for like $3,000 now. We got it for more like 10,000. But what you see, it's a blind robot. So there is no camera on it yet. Near the end of the talk, I'll show you experiments with vision. It's blind, but it's walking. And it's walking in this fairly difficult terrain, which it cannot see. Okay. And here's another example. So this is the same robot with the same policy. No parameters are changed. And now it's walking downstairs. So basically, it has to rely on proprioception plus what it senses on the feet in order to plan its strategy. Okay, here's another example. Here, there's like this dip in the grass. So it cannot even if its vision system was active, it would not know what that dip in the grass was. More examples. Okay. In varying kinds of terrain. So that is the challenge. You're blind and you're walking in these different terrains. What you have access to is proprioception and knowledge of what in biology is called the efference copy, the commands that you issued. And here's like some construction site and all that stuff. And here's unstable or damp ground. And then I think they have an example on sand. And what's notable is that it's the same policy to walk in all of these terrains. And we'll show examples of indoor and outdoor stuff in a second. Okay. So this work, we published it at Robotic Science and Systems in 2021, so a few months ago. And I want to start by acknowledging co-authors, Ashish Kumar, who's actually on the call right here, who's my PhD student at Berkeley, Deepak Pathak, who's now at CMU, but used to be at Berkeley and at FAIR in between, and then Zipeng Fu, who's a student with Deepak. So we have developed an approach which we call rapid motor adaptation. And that's kind of the secret sauce here for making this legged robot work. And the talk is going to be about that. Okay, so let's start with some background. So the business of animals walking, the study of animals walking has gone on for quite some time. And there's a whole field of biomechanics, okay, which was actually pioneered by Galileo and Borelli and people like that. And one of the starting observations is that animals have gaits. These are patterns of sort of foot movements. And now we move to modern times. So there's a paper from 1965 where people started to systematically study these gaits. And these are recordings of what the support patterns are of the, like LH here stands for left hind and left front and right hand, and solid circle means that the foot is on the ground and so forth. And this very naturally connected to a notion which was pretty common in neuroscience at the time, what's called CPG, or central pattern generators. So the idea is that when you're dealing with periodic motions, then you need some neurons which will fire in those periodic patterns. So imagine basically you're getting sine waves and cosine waves, patterns of activation of certain neurons, and then you wire them up in appropriate ways. You see some proposed circuits here, and now you can get various kinds of behavior. And these have been proposed for, obviously, for walking, but also for fish swimming and birds flying and heartbeats and all the rest of it. You take this idea and then you translate it to sort of the world of robotics and AI and so forth. And one of the earliest works and most famous work here, obviously, is that of Mark Rabert, done by your colleagues in the AI lab. And then this, of course, work led to Boston Dynamics, which is the leading company in legged locomotion. And by and large, the style has been to take these gaits seriously and to design control laws for implementing gaits. And we might have different gaits like walk or gallop or trot and so forth. So that's the history. And this is like the dominant paradigm in robotics in this. Okay, now let's look at what locomotion is in the real world. Okay, so here, I mean, at the bottom, you have these two guys climbing on rocks and scrambling around. And we can also look at these kids. And do you see them walking in a systematic, steady walk or a gallop or a canter or whatever? I don't. Okay. So I think real world walking is much, much more flexible than we give people credit for. And, so when babies learn to walk, they do this sort of side thing. Now, the person who studied this most systematically and whose work was a real inspiration to us is Karen Adolph. So Professor Karen Adolph is at NYU, and she studied babies learning to walk. And she tries to do it in real world situations. She is kind of a Gibsonian kind of person. So she really believes in doing it in as close to real world settings. And I'll just show you. And she has this beautiful phrase that instead of thinking of movement as gaits, it is better to think of it as bouts of steps. Okay, and I think I'll show you this will become more clear. So here's this baby, a kid, a toddler, learning to walk. Okay, now we notice that, and we'll do watch this. This is from Karen's lab. Now let's do the same thing at low speed, okay? So what she does is, this SSFFBB is encoding of her steps. She walks sideways, she takes a few front steps and then backward steps. And this is typical. I mean, of course, all of us are doing this all the time. So trying to say, oh, the problem for robotics is there are these gaits, we will design controllers for those gaits, and that's it. And that's the solution to the walking problem. Seems to me wrong-headed because there's this flexibility of the phenomena that we are ignoring in this way. Okay, so that's the context. So that's historical context of for our project, that we started out saying we don't like these pre-programmed gaits. We started out looking at some of the literature from child development seriously. But now we are going to have a bunch of these questions, and we need a good way to think about them together and not confuse ourselves. And I want to argue that Nicholas Tinbergen's 4 questions are the right model. For people who come from a vision background, you may have heard of Marr's 3 levels of analysis of sort of a theory, an algorithm, and an implementation level. I think Tinbergen was there like 20 years before Marr, and I think these questions are in a way more interesting and more encompassing. So there are 4 questions which I have marked here in red. So when we want to understand, let's say, walking, we should do it at these different levels, and an answer at one level is not in competition with an answer at another level. So first we have the level of the mechanism. So this is like the causal level. So there are certain neural networks which are producing certain kinds of firings, which then causes certain muscles to contract and so forth. So there's an explanation at the level of physical causation, which is what we need. We certainly need that level of understanding, or if you're a biologist, you do. There's a different question, which is, how did those mechanisms arise? That's a development question, or the ontogeny question. How's the behavior? So this is like a learning question. If you want to convert this to sort of the robotic setting, this is a learning question. How do we learn that behavior? How much is due to the particular kinds of inputs you give in, what is inbuilt, etc. But these are still how questions. We also have why questions. And why questions are also very important, and sometimes that's where the interesting answers are. One is evolution. This is of interest in biology, not so much maybe for computer vision or robotics, which is how did, so walking behavior. We have walking in insects, we have walking in dogs, we have walking in humans. How did these evolve? And then there's adaptation, which in a way is perhaps the most interest to people with a computational bent, which is sort of the normative aspect of this. Why is this adaptive? Why does this particular pattern make sense? So in computer vision, the answers might be in terms of the ecological statistics of the world we live in. And I want to assert that these 4 levels are all important. These 4 questions are all important, but they're not to be confused with each other. An answer of question A is not in conflict with an answer of question C. Okay. So what we're going to do now in the rest of my talk is structured according to Tinbergen's 4 questions. And I'm going to develop an artificial walking approach, which is going to, which we can understand in these 4 terms. So let's start with the first one, which is sort of the mechanism. So this is the core of it. So this is like the high level view of what the robot does when it walks. So our key insight is that it is very important to adapt to different terrains. So I can walk on hard ground, I can walk on sand, I can walk on grass, I can walk on mushy surfaces, etc., etc. So the most important thing is to be able to adapt to different terrains, and this adaptation should be occurring in real time, meaning you can't take like 1 minute to adapt to being in a different terrain, right? And humans are adapting all the time. We walk in sand, we walk on hard ground. We can walk successfully even if I have sprained my ankle or if I'm carrying a 30-pound backpack. So look at these 2 red blocks here. So there's going to be a basic policy here, which is at 100 hertz, it's sort of issuing commands, the actions. And action here means the desired joint angles of all the 12 joints of this robot. Okay, and since we are talking at LIDS, I should get my terminology straight. So I'm going to use a mixture of control theory people's terminology and reinforcement learning people's terminology. So control theory people refer to the state as with X and control with U. Okay, the people in reinforcement learning use S for state and A for actions. So I'm splitting the difference. So for me, state is X, okay, and it's a vector, right? And then the actions are A and not U. So I thought, why should I keep using some Russian letters? Let's use American English letters of A. Okay. So there's going to be a base policy which determines the basic walking behavior of this robot, right? It's going to basically issue what are the right joint angles that you need at the next time instant. And then there's a lowest level PD controller, which is running on top of that. But that's a core, and this is going to be trained with reinforcement learning. But let's come to that later. But this policy gets an extra argument, which is this Z sub t. And this Z sub t is basically going to capture the different physical conditions of walking. So in sand versus hard ground versus grass versus, planks and rubble, this Z sub t will change. It will also change when you change some, put some load on the robot, make its feet slippery. All of that changes its ZT. So essentially, the policy always is responding to different conditions because it gets this ZT as one argument, which corresponds to the extrinsics of the environment. So the policy basically works by knowing it's going to issue a command for all the joints of the robot. It gets as input the previous actions and the previous state. So the previous actions are denoted by A. The previous state is denoted by X, and this extrinsics. So this extrinsics now has to be estimated, right? And I'm blind. I can't even use vision to say, oh, this is sand, so let me switch to Z vector such and such. So the way this is going to be determined is by this adaptation module. And the job of the adaptation module is, it's like a meta thing. It's running on top of the base policy. And its signal is my past history. So I'm commanding my state at t-1, up to t-50. So the past 50 time instance. Okay, so I know what my state was. I also know what actions I commanded, right? The robot, because I issued those commands. And so in biology, this would be proprioception and what's called the efference copy. So I'm going to use what I did in the past as a signal. The idea is simple. Suppose I'm walking in sand. I issue a certain command. I want to lift up my foot. Now, lifting up my foot takes longer, or it happens less easily because I'm in sand. Well, that will be revealed by my joint angles. So how my body responds to the same set of commands, in some sense, reveals the terrain and various characteristics of it. And those are going to basically be used as signal by this adaptation module to estimate these extrinsic parameters. And then it's going to run, it's going to result in the base policy giving different kinds of actions. And that's it. You now know what is the system at deployment time or the system at test time. It's that simple. This part is kind of standard. Our novelty is adding this idea of an adaptation module which runs in real time. Okay, so now I've addressed the first of Tinbergen's 4 questions. Now let's get to the second question, which is how is this acquired? How do we acquire the base policy, and how do we acquire this adaptation policy? So we do it as follows. So first, let's understand the base policy. So basically, we are going to use reinforcement learning on this in simulation on this kind of a fractal terrain. Okay, so you see our quadruped, it's walking on this fractal terrain, and fractal terrain will have different frequencies on the terrain. So there are high frequencies, which mean more jagged kind of stuff, which it has to learn to, it has to learn to walk without falling down, or it can be more gentle slopes, which are also important. So, so the basic policy is trained by learning to walk in this using, PPO and pretty standard stuff. You need to have a nice reward function, and there's a lot of ugly stuff buried in reward functions typically, but we use very, very clean reward functions motivated by the biomechanics. You want to minimize your energy and you minimize ground impact. Okay. And the policy gets as an argument, it gets its previous state and action and this extrinsic vector Z sub t. Okay, now what is this extrinsic vector? So at training time in simulation, I can vary lots of physical parameters, such as the mass of the robot, position, center of mass, friction, terrain height, motor strength, etc. So there are lots of these things which we can vary in simulation, right? And these are known to us. So this is privileged information we have at training time. This idea has been used before by the folks in ETH Zurich. Now, what we do is we take, we'll run different simulations with different choices of these parameters. We're just randomizing these and letting the robot experience a variety of settings. And these can be down-coded from like 16 parameters to 8 parameters. And that's just like a usual encoder-decoder setup. And then we can train the base policy. So this is pretty straightforward. So this is how you learn to walk in simulation. Okay. Okay. So in more detail, there is a base policy, which is learning to walk, trained with reinforcement learning using PPO, takes about 1 billion samples, takes about 24 hours to train. Okay. And this physics simulation, we are changing the parameters of that. We are changing some of these parameters here, and you are changing and of course, from trial to trial, the terrain is different. So this is the basic setup for learning to walk in simulation. Okay, and then of course, the way the policy is informed about what the environment is by giving it as an extra argument. And that's through this decoder to just compress it down from 16 to 8. No big deal, okay. Okay, but now what happens is that this, now we have a problem, which is that suppose I wanted to deploy this policy that I trained. This policy was trained with privileged information, right? Which was available at training time in my simulator. But in the real world, I don't know these things, right? I don't know the mass, I don't know the true friction, terrain height, motor strength, etc. So what do? So I must somehow estimate these. Actually, I won't estimate these guys. I'll estimate the slightly reduced dimensionality version Z sub t. So these are the unknown extrinsics. So how can I estimate them? I'm now moving around in the world and I have to estimate these. So the idea is that, okay, let's see. That the extrinsics can be estimated from your observation history. So these will be estimated online. So what's going to happen is there will be this magical adaptation module. Okay, and I'm going to tell you in a bit how we train this. This adaptation module has access to the past history of the state X and the actions commanded in the last 50 time steps. Okay. And from that, it is going to estimate the Z. Okay. And now we can run it at test time and deployment when we don't have access to this privileged information. So these Z's are kind of like this proxy latent variable, which in the actual simulations corresponds to these kinds of physics parameters. But now we're just going to treat them as some latent variables with some eight-dimensional latent variable, which we must estimate with this adaptation module. So now we have to solve this meta problem of how to train this adaptation module. How are we going to do this? And this is the idea I said upfront. There's going to be a discrepancy between the expected movement and the actual measured movement. And this is what I want to use to estimate Z sub t. So what we're going to do is we're going to operate in 2 phases. So in the first phase, we just run vanilla reinforcement learning. We train a base policy with this physics simulator. Okay. And this base policy gets to experience a variety of terrains and this variety of these conditions like mass, motor strength, friction, etc., which are known to us in simulation, and they are encoded down into this 8-dimensional extrinsic vector Z sub t. So this is phase 1 of training, where the base policy is being trained. Phase 2 is where the adaptation policy is being trained. So the base policy is kept fixed. I just copy it over. Now, what is this adaptation module going to learn? It's going to have access to the last 50 time steps. But what we have is we have a target for the Z sub t. So if it knew the mass, friction, etc., from that we would get the Z sub t. And because this is still a simulation time, I have access to that Z sub t. So what I will do is I will make my adaptation module spit out the same Z sub t. So I could get to a Z sub t either from true knowledge of the physics parameters running through this environmental decoder, or from my past history of 50 time steps run through this adaptation module. And what I do is I will try to make these two match up. Okay, so it's actually a straightforward supervised learning problem, because at training time, I have access to this privileged information. At training time, I also have access to my last 50 time steps of state and action history. And this adaptation module is some neural network, and we're going to change the parameters of this neural network such that it spits out the same Z sub t that I would have got if I had knowledge of the true physics. And now I've trained my adaptation module. So this is my answer to the question 2 of Tinbergen, the learning approach. First, you train the base policy, then you train this adaptation policy. And it is operating with this privileged information, which you have because you are in simulation. Now, I'm not going to assert that this directly goes over to a biological organism, because a biological organism will not have access to this privileged information in this way. So there's some other learning strategy which is needed. But it's just like backprop is not the way probably biological neural networks get trained, but it's like an as if kind of answer. So that's it. And then we can deploy this policy. We have the last 50 seconds of history, which is you are always running these both base policy and adaptation module. And the adaptation module is constantly changing Z. It's in some asynchronous mode, and the Z is being used as an argument to the base policy, and then you keep on moving, literally. And now we'll show you some experiments. So these are kind of difficult setups. Okay. I mean, it doesn't fit a gallop or a canter or a trot, right? Okay. And in fact, we've tried it in a wide variety of indoor conditions. So all these experiments were done during the COVID era, and most of them are in Ashish's apartment. You can see that very much work done at home aspect of this work. Okay, and now we can do some comparison. So A1, the robot comes with its controller, which is your standard control system type of planning. Okay, and then this is what our controller does, which is basically, I think, just it's benefiting from this adaptation. So as it moves, it adapts very quickly, right? So it's adapting in like 0.1, 0.2 second kind of time frame, and therefore it can deal with these things. More examples. So on the top is the A1 controller, which comes from with the manufacturer. And then there is our robot. See, it's struggling a bit, but then it manages to do it. More examples. Okay, A1's controller fails, and our controller can manage to work with this foam. Okay, and then you can, a fair comparison might be, oh, maybe we know, maybe the secret is just whether the use of RL versus control theory. No, we can use our own system without this adaptation module. And let's see what happens. So this is RMA, is we call this rapid motor adaptation. This is how RMA works. And now we can rerun the experiment without this adaptation module, and this poor guy falls down. Okay, more examples. So it's really the adaptation which is key to success. And adaptation is, of course, known in biology. I mean, of course, in perception, we talk about it as generalization, but adaptation is a characteristic of all motor control systems. And these are examples going back, 100 years, 200 years, right? We all can, if I put a weight on your backpack, I tape up your arm, I can still work. And we chose to take this as the most important thing to study. And here are some, okay, so here's another fun example. So what Ashish is doing is that he's pouring oil on this surface, and then, okay, and the robot has legs which are plastic sheets. So it starts to slip. Okay, so now you'll see it in slow-mo. So it starts to slip. Now in this process, what's happening is that adaptation module is re-estimating Z. And then it will use that other new Z for making better actions. And in fact, here's a slide which shows you this in detail. So Z is an 8-dimensional vector, and two of those dimensions are being shown here, ones which were interesting. And what you see is that these Z values change, okay, and they are estimated in real time. I mean, it's an idea not that different from, if you think classically, Kalman filters and estimating the state from a sequence of observations and so on and so forth, right? It's just this idea, but converted into the neural network and reinforcement learning world. And then of course, as the Z's change, then the robot's action changes. So it may start to apply greater force or less force or whatever is needed. And this is the pattern of footsteps.
Maybe a quick clarification, Jitendra. So the adaptation module is trained with a supervised loss over the Z variable, right?
Correct.
And is that trained just in simulation, or is fine-tuned also in real data?
It is just trained in simulation. In the real world, we just take the robot out, we switch it on, and it works.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so this is an example of the same thing with this weight throw, and then there's an adaptation phase, and then the gate recovers. Okay, so there's a lot of work in locomotion. I mean, this is, I think, a boring slide which just lists every work, but I think and there's work on learning. So I don't want to say we are the first to do learning, but I think here is where the big novelty comes in, which is that traditionally you train in simulation and then you try to go to the real world and you have what is called the sim to real gap. And our insight was sim to real. Yes, that's a problem. And one way people try to do it is by robustification. So you try to expose it to all sorts of conditions and have it work in all of them. To me, this is a suboptimal way to do it. You don't want to be robust, you want to adapt. You want to do the right thing for the specific situation you are in, rather than something which is safe for all conditions. Okay. So sim to real is the standard concern, but we said we are equally concerned about real to real, walking in sand versus hard ground. So that means adapting all the time. And once you can adapt all the time, you can of course adapt from sim to real too. So that is the big novelty of our work. And we can do it really fast. There are people who have developed approaches for doing this adaptation in the real world. Like, for example, Sergey Levin's group did stuff where it takes 3 minutes. Now, in my view, you don't have 3 minutes of walking if you're in an unsafe condition. You need to be adapting in 0.1 second or 0.2 second or something like that. So that's the contribution here. Okay. Okay, there are some numbers which show that you can try the alternative approaches, which are like systems ID, try to estimate all the parameters, try to be robust, and that instead this approach is RMA without adaptation doesn't work as well as RMA. So these details you can all find in the RSS paper. These are more all experiments. These are physical experiments where we compare the RMA policy with RMA without adaptation, and then the A1 controller, and we measure the percentage of success, how far it moved, and so forth. And again, these results, since the paper was accepted, these results must have been good enough. Okay, but let's get to what are the most important points. The policy was there's no hand-coded or heuristic control stack here. Okay, there is a terrain generalization with limited training, and there's an asynchronous design for low compute. And let's just show some more examples. So emergent behavior to avoid obstacles. So this guy is walking, and then it's going to come to a rock which is a bit too big. So it's going to try repeatedly and manage just to get past. So we get this kind of cool looking behavior, which at least to creators of the system is very, because we never programmed any of this, right? Okay, here are examples. Okay, more, okay. Yeah, and that was quadrupeds, and people in the business know that bipeds are harder than quadrupeds. So we have a collaboration with colleagues in mechanical engineering, Kaushal Srinath's lab, Zhongyuli, and these are our initial results. This is ongoing, and this is like very recent work. But you can see this biped, it's called Cassie, and walking in terrain with like these various obstacles and planks and so forth. And there is this bar at the top, but that bar is not providing any force because you can see it's a loose thread. It's just to deal with the fact that if there are failures, then you need to pick it up and all that. And you don't want Cassie damaged. And again, the idea was the same. Train and simulation, you have an RMA module. You just need a different simulator because it's a different robot. And otherwise the approach works. Okay, next let's go to training this robot to walk at different speeds, because it's kind of boring to be only going at one speed. And if you think about the biological setting, there's a considerable premium on speed. Cheetah hunting and antelope. Both the cheetah and the antelope have to be fast runners, and plus they need to be able to maintain these speeds at sustained periods of time. So let's train so what we decided was, in our controller, we have a desired speed, right? 0.5 meters per second. And that's one of the loss function terms, in addition to energy and impact. And now what we can do is we can train it by giving different desired speeds. So this is what you get with when you give it this speed. And here we are giving it a larger desired speed. Okay. And then it will have to walk in different terrains, but that part is easy because RMA takes care of that. Okay, and then this is the highest speeds we tried. Okay, this is really fast, given the size of this robot. Okay, and then okay, and in this, by the way, you see the flight phase. There's a time when all 4 of the legs are above the ground. Okay, and now we can do some more systematic studies. So this is the walk. So the footfall pattern for a walk, which is at 0.375 meters per second. Then so in the animal locomotion literature, these gaits have names, and these gaits for us are obviously not programmed. They just emerge. We just set a certain speed and say, go at 0.375 meters per second. And something emerges which we can call a walk. You give it 0.9 meters per second, something emerges which we can call a trot, and so on. In fact, this don't need to be different policies. We can train different policies, and then we can distill them all into one policy which we call a velocity condition policy. This is standard ideas on distillation. And then it's one policy which you can just give it a parameter, an argument. Okay, go at 0.6 meters per second and go at 0.6 meters per second. Because presumably the cheetah decides at what speed to go at various times. So this is the velocity condition policy. So we are going to give it, we are telling it to go at different speeds at different times. It's got a schedule which it is trying to honor. Okay, and the adaptation to different terrains comes easily because of RMA. Okay, and note that it figures out how to do this transition of gaits and so on. So my understanding of what happens in systems like Boston Dynamics is that all of these gaits are pre-programmed, and whereas in our setup, everything, you've heard all the secret sauce. You train a policy, and then you have this idea of an adaptation module. Okay, so RMA enables the policy. So I think now it's kind of, there'll be just more examples, which I want to. Okay, I think I will, let me skip through these, but just it can work with the different kinds of payload. Okay, then trot, maybe this example is cool. So robustness in going through bushes and so on, okay, at higher speeds. And then gallop, this looks scary, but it worked, okay. And note, all of this is out of the box. There is no real world adaptation or tweaking of parameters. It's because it has this RMA policy, which is trained in simulation. Okay, and okay, but I think I should stop these demos and return to Tinbergen's questions. Okay, so so how do I think about all of this? I want to think about all of this in terms of adaptation. Why I need to go at different speeds. So what is the benefit that I get from going by having these different gates? And this is, of course, a topic which has been studied in biomechanics. And the leading answer is this one from Hoyt and Taylor, which is that these emerge because of the desire to be energy efficient. So they walk, trot, and gallop. So you can maintain like humans can walk even fast and they can run very slow, but there are regimes where certain energies are most efficient, certain gates are most efficient. So they measured energy consumption with like oxygen consumed and so on. So there is at low speeds, walks are more efficient. So low energy is being consumed at this speed. This is the optimum. You get a different curve for trotting and you get a different curve for galloping. So galloping is more efficient at higher speeds, right? Because at this speed, you want to be trotting rather than galloping because galloping uses more energy. But out here, galloping will use less energy than trotting. And so we have a paper on this, which is coming out at Coral right now. So minimizing energy consumption leads to the emergence of gates. And we have done these experiments. So we train in simulation at different speeds, deploy, but we actually did measurements of energy. So energy here can be computed by the torque times the velocity. And so we can do like a MPC curve, create these curves for these MPC gates. And those are these curves which have the right behavior, that walking is more efficient at low speeds and trot is more efficient at intermediate and so on. And then these stars correspond to that for our system. So we're not actually measuring the energy from the motors, or there's certainly no counterpart of oxygen consumption, but it's being done through this torque Q dot calculations. So that's the explanation. Then we can relate animals to robots, and different animals have different Froude numbers. So this is like these Reynolds number and so forth, these various dimensionless constants. So this is V squared upon GL. So V being velocity, G is gravitational acceleration, L is the height of the hip or something. And it turns out that you switch gates at different Froude numbers, and our robot seems to be most similar to sheep, because these numbers are pretty similar for sheep and for the A1 robot. And it's the same system which in this kind of complex terrain, like this sort of stuff, where the idea of a gallop or a trot does not make sense, it still does the right thing. And it's the same system. Okay, so it's flexible across that whole range rather than pre-programmed for certain gates. So that's so the way you want to think about it is energy is important, because a lot of the animal's energy is used up in locomotion. And so you want to move as fast as possible, move at your desired speed, but with minimum energy. And that accounts for the emergence of gates. And this is a why question. This is not a how question. And we should not mix up answers of why questions and how questions. And then finally, let me turn to evolution. And what does evolution tell us about locomotion? Evolution tells us that locomotion involved in concert with perception. And I have a slide which somehow I managed to miss, which is on the Cambrian era, which is when 500 million years ago, when there was this big spurt, and both animals were able to move, so they could find food in new places, and they could see, because that would direct where to go. And I like this quote of Gibson: we see in order to move and we move in order to see. And our robot currently is blind. It's not without any reception, any sensing, because it's got proprioception. But obviously for doing any long range navigation, you want to use vision. So, and there are lots of beautiful experiments that colleagues in vision and motor control have done. For example, when humans walk at differing speeds and different kinds of terrain, they choose different speeds, they look near or far based on terrain. So all of these kinds of findings, in my view, should just emerge from a decent normative theory. And so we've started to build that. And so here are initial experiments. So here's this robot. Now we put some cameras on the head of the robot, this Intel cameras, and then these return RGPD of the terrain in front. This constructs a top-down occupancy map. Then you use an FMM-based planner, and then everything is done on board the robot. Okay, and then maybe this will show you something moving. So this robot is going to manage to avoid these obstacles. So it's got there's a camera on the head of the robot, which it is using, and it manages to move, get to the goal state, and avoiding this. So, so that shows that we have at least initial results on the coupling of vision and control. I think later steps are going to be pretty easy and fast, because there's been a lot of work which has been done on mobile robots, and including in my group at Berkeley. And that problem is, I think, in pretty good shape. So basically, we have to do walking instead of mobile wheeled robots. And walking is actually more fun and more interesting, because walking gives you the ability to walk in a variety of terrain, to jump over potholes and so on, where a wheeled robot would have trouble. But I think it's all very doable. And I want to conclude by thanking you, and with this nice picture of variety of terrains in which our robot can work. Thank you very much.
I'm sure there is a virtual round of applause now. Thank you so much, Jitendra. It's so unique to have a talk which is able to cover from the how to the why. It's really fascinating. And somehow, as you anticipated, a bunch of questions already showed up in the chat, and they were answered partially in the chat, but I'm sure there are many more. So let's see what you have here. There is a question from Mihail asking, can you condition the working speed and energetic cost on a defined goal?
No, so we are conditioning, we are choosing a speed. Okay. Now the goal direction here has to always be picked. So the robot can move in any direction at any speed, basically. So that we have a policy which can do that. Okay, and this is what is needed. So earlier we just developed it, trained the robot to move. So so it's like version 0, 1, 2, 3, so forth, right? So the first version just moved straight ahead at a fixed speed. Then we developed, then we trained it for different speeds, and then we have trained it for different directions. And that combination is what becomes more interesting now when we are studying visual locomotion. Because I need to avoid obstacles, so I need to go in different directions. And if the terrain is very clear, I should go fast. If the terrain is very crowded, I should go slow. So hopefully all those things will just emerge.
Yeah, so to just...
yeah. And this is Ashish, by the way, who's...
So to just add to that, so...
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, so to add to that, I think between walking speed and energetic cost, we only need to specify the walking speed, because at any speed, we are trying to minimize the energy which is consumed. So for our thing, we only need to specify the speed, and the energy is taken care of implicitly because we have trained to minimize that. And when we do have a defined goal, like in the last video of navigation we saw, we will use a planner to output the direction and the speed. So it will be on a defined goal. So we can just give it a target goal, and it will automatically figure out the right speed to walk in and the right directions to move in. And that itself will lead to automatically switching gates and so on.
Cool, thanks. So let's see if there are more questions. I have a bunch of questions on my side, but I want to open it up. I'm sure there are many more. maybe Jitendra, I can ask for a clarification because I was a little bit confused about two things. So the adaptation model, of course, like, the very interesting aspect is the capability of transferring from sim to real, like, in a effortless way, I would say. And I don't understand what is the secret there, because the adaptation module, like, has to learn this mapping essentially from the X and the actions, like, from the last few steps to this, to this latent representation. So I'm wondering, like, how much effort you have to do in simulation to make sure that the adaptation model does not overfit to a specific type of robot. Maybe do you randomize the type of robots? Do you randomize the type of environments? Do you randomize the parameters maybe of the robot?
No, the robot is the same. I think there are some parameters like torque, strengths of the motor, friction, which are robot specific, which are varied. And then there are parameters of the terrain, which are varied. So here is how one analogy, and Ashish should speak more about all the experimental conditions that he used. But I want to give this analogy to something which my vision friends like Ted and Ruth and Phil will understand. It's a concept of a metamer. So I will not have a situation in simulation which will be exactly like walking on sand, but it will be as if it is like walking on sand. Okay, so there will be these variations, and then what we are doing is it's a very complex world, right? And it's really the world and the robot. But what I'm reducing it down to is this 8-dimensional vector of extrinsics, okay, which is what the policy is only affected by those 8 dimensions. And the effects of all the other variables are channeled through this bottleneck of those eight numbers. Okay, so what you need is a sufficient richness in your training regime such that there is something like what I will encounter in real life in that as channeled through this 8-dimensional vector. Now, I think that's the intuition that I have. And this is the concept of a metamer. We can have different colors of light and different spectral distributions, which look the same to a human observer because projected onto the space, the receptor sensitivity function of the 3 cone types, you get the same 3 numbers. So this is like a visual, this is like a motor metamer, but this is just an intuition which maybe works for you, maybe doesn't work for you. But Ashish, please say something about the variety of training conditions.
Yeah, so the metamer analogy is accurate because we do go from a high dimensional list of all the things we are varying to a very low dimensional thing. So we go from like 17 to 8 dimensions. So there's going to be a lot of redundant mapping from the high to low dimension. In the high dimension, we vary like the friction of the terrain, the strength of each of the motors. We vary what mass is kept on the back of the robot and what is the center of mass of the robot as well. And then we also feed in like a scalar terrain height which changes as the robot moves. So if it is not able to get with a certain amount of clearance, it tries to increase it to continue walking.
It does answer. Like, indeed, my second question was about, why do you need this compression, like, from 17 dimension, like, to 8, and that's exactly what you address here. Okay.
Yeah. So even in the experiments, we compare to directly predicting the 17 numbers. So in simulation, we can alternately directly just try to predict the uncompressed version and then keep everything else the same. So we have comparisons and we see that that's actually a much harder task because figuring out the exact friction from the fact that the leg is slipping, depends very critically on how much slip did we measure. But figuring out that, oh, now that we are slipping, we just need to change how we walk so that we are more conservative. That is a slightly easier task.
I mean, so classic control theory, people would say do systems ID, right? Which is trying to estimate everything. And we are saying, no, that's a bad idea. That violates Vapnik's principle. When you're trying to solve a hard problem, don't solve an intermediate problem, which is even harder. Okay. And furthermore, there are then identifiability issues, right? Because certain parameters can trade off with each other. So if you're trying to measure each of them exactly, you're screwed. However, if you measure this reduced space, it may be perfectly fine.
Makes sense. Okay. let's see if there is more. I have one last question, but I don't want to take over also because we are almost out of time.
Yeah.
So let's see if
And by the way,
more.
I'm willing to be around for more time for answering other questions for the people who are really, really interested in this topic. But of course, people may want to go on, do the rest of other aspects of their life. Yeah.
Okay, Jitendra, if you don't mind, let me ask real quick, the last question, and
Yes.
and then we'll officially close it here.
Yeah.
I was curious about the last part of the presentation, which is about when you start having exteroceptive sensors, looking at the environment and so on. I think you mentioned about you mentioned the use of occupancy maps or intermediate representations. How are they going to? What is the interplay between the intermediate representation and the latent space, the latent variable z? Is the occupancy map going to replace the z? Or
No, I think they are two separate spaces. So think of the occupancy map as derived from vision, right? Yep. And this latent space z is essentially driven by it's more like the motor conditions, if you will. So there is again, the classic control theory statement would be there's a separation principle, right? Perception and action. So we don't have perception, a separation principle with respect to what's going on in the proprioceptive space. But I can imagine that there's a perception, there's a separation principle between high-level vision, building a map, versus the planning of action in that map.
But in that case, why not adopting the same idea as the metamer, in which I guess the occupancy map in a way is a metamer for you, but why not using just a neural network to compress that down?
Yeah. So the occupancy map and this is, by the way, like version 1, right? So in a year or two, you may see more different kinds of ideas there. So now I'll appeal more to the work that our group did in mobile robots. I don't believe that building a SLAM style map is necessary. I think SLAM is both unnecessary and it's both overkill, and also it doesn't contain some of the information we want, which is more semantic in nature. For example, we would want to know about the different kinds of terrain. Is this soft terrain or hard terrain, right? Not just find out when you get there, but in advance. So we need representations which don't need to be as complete as SLAM, but they should be good enough for planning paths. And what we have right now is like version 0, basically, which that enables us to show the basic capabilities. Yeah.
I also think that even in the final version, the visual map, even if it is learned, won't replace the z vector that we get from proprioception, because there are some things such as a weight change or a slip, which proprioception can figure out, but a visual system might not see any difference between those. So I think both of them will complement each other. Things like terrain are done more efficiently by the visual system, and those should be replaced. But I think that in the limit, both of them will actually be there in the final system.
Beautiful. Excited to see the next steps here. Okay, I think unfortunately, I'm sure the discussion can keep going and will keep going, but I will officially close the seminar here. And thanks to Jitendra again for the amazing talk. So another round of applause here. And thanks again for the time, Jitendra. If you're going to stay a little bit longer, I invite whoever is interested in asking more questions to stick around and ask more questions. But otherwise, we'll officially close it here.
Yeah, thank you all very much, and I really enjoyed this. Yes.
Likewise. So Francisco,